Amityville Horror. The supernatural events said to have happened inside this house inspired a bestseller book and a box office hit. Claimed to be based on true events, this is the story of America's most terrifying haunting. A family driven from their home by demonic forces.
I said, I hope this is as close to hell as I ever get. It's like evil personified.
The story of the haunting of the Lutz family terrified a country. But some believed the Amityville Horror was nothing more than an elaborate deception.
As far as I'm concerned, it's a hoax. It always has been.
Or is there another story? A case of a family haunted by their own fears.
There are no haunted places, only haunted people.
What happened inside this house tore apart this quiet corner of suburbia.
It was, shocking. I don't know the words to tell you what, it felt like.
For those that lived through it, this is the true story of the Amityville Horror. Amityville Village, on the south shore of Long Island, New York. Home to what is supposedly the most notorious haunted house in the world. It was in 1965 that Ronald DeFeo Sr. and his wife Louise moved into 112 Ocean Avenue with their 5 children. They were second-generation Italian-Americans from Brooklyn, looking to start a new life in the peaceful suburbs of Amityville. The DeFeos named their home High Hopes. It symbolized everything they'd ever worked for. As a child, Patrick O'Reilly lived next door to the family. He became close friends with the DeFeo children and often stayed over at their house.
They were really nice people. They were loving people. And they treated everyone just wonderfully. And everyone who came into the house was treated the same way. They remodeled the house and put a built-in pool in the backyard. So summers were, jumping off the diving board, screaming yippee yappy yahooey all day long. I just pretty much became part of the family.
But in the early hours of November the 13th, 1974, the DeFeos' lives were brutally cut short. The mother, father, and 4 of their 5 children were found murdered in their beds. Local reporter Joel Martin was one of the first journalists on the scene.
We're talking about 6 murders, a whole family wiped out. Shock doesn't begin to describe the way people felt about it. It was national news from the first moment because amity, which is a word for calm or peaceful, kind of represents what this town was all about. Nobody ever dreamed something like this could happen.
O'Reilly was just 14 at the time of the tragedy. This is the first time he's spoken publicly of the murders.
The prefect of my dormitory came in and said, Patrick, I need you to come talk with me. I went to the prefect's room, sat with him, and he told me that he had some terrible news to tell me. That was horrific. He told me that my sister and brother would be up to collect me. That's how I found out. It was quite a spectacle around my house. Tremendous amount of police at the house. There was a lot of reporters. You couldn't go to the house, and that was hard because it's where you wanted to be. I guess a lot was disbelief. You didn't believe it was true. I think I felt that way for years. I just remember sitting around waiting for news, who did it, how did this happen,
In New York, on November the 13th, 1974, the residents of normally peaceful Amityville awoke to horrific news. 6 members of the same family had been found murdered in their beds. The next day, police arrested the eldest surviving son. 23-year-old Ronnie DeFeo Jr., nicknamed Butch by his friends, confessed to shooting his parents and siblings with his father's shotgun.
Standing about 20 feet away, he aimed the gun in the dark and shot and killed both parents. Then he went into his brother's room and he shot both of them. And then he went up to his sister's room and killed them. After that, he cleaned up as best he could. He washed himself.
Ronnie then discarded the murder weapon in the creek behind the DeFeo home. Later that day, he went to work as usual.
When he came home, he walked into the house, saw his family members, and went to the local bar where he hangs out, screaming, my family have been shot, they've been killed.
With Ronnie awaiting trial, the press started to speculate on the motive for the murders. Some reports claimed he wanted to cash in on his family's life insurance policy. Other rumors suggested he'd been tipped over the edge by witnessing repeated domestic violence, an allegation that Patrick O'Reilly adamantly denies.
I read a lot in the papers how the DeFeos were not only loud, but they were brutal. That Mr. DeFeo slapped Mrs. DeFeo and slapped the kids. Why I think this was written, I don't know. But it just wasn't true. Mr. DeFeo was a strict man, but he was also a very religious man. He wanted the best for his kids. I never saw him raise his hand.
As the defense team prepared for the trial, it emerged that Ronnie had a history of drug abuse and regularly took heroin and LSD. He claimed that on the night of the murders, he heard voices telling him to commit the crime. The defense ultimately chose a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity.
The evidence that I produced stated that Ronnie was insane, that he didn't understand the nature of his act when he was doing it, and that he had completely disassociated himself from the murderous acts that he was performing.
But Weber lost the case. In November 1975, a year after the murders, the jury found Ronald Butch DeFeo guilty. He was sentenced to 6 life terms in prison.
Ronnie was guilty, and Ronnie went away, and that's where I thought, and everybody else thought, that's where this horrible story would end. Never dreamed that this story would go on forever. Never, ever thought that.
With Ronnie behind bars, back in Amityville, the DeFeo family home stood empty. It was put on the market at a bargain price. For newlyweds, George and Kathy Lutz, 112 Ocean Avenue is their perfect family home, and at a price they could afford. Although aware of its tragic history, they decided it was something they could live with.
We went home and we sat around as a family and talked about it for quite a while. And it was decided that it would be okay.
On the 18th of December, the Lutz family and their 3 children moved in. But over the next 28 days, they claimed to have experienced a series of terrifying supernatural events. Wild fluctuations in temperature, the stench of fetid odors, and slime appearing on the walls and floors.
The slime was like gelatin, like drops of gelatin on the carpet going from room to room.
Kathy said she felt an invisible presence touch her, and that she heard loud scrapes and bangs in empty rooms. George is reported to have discovered a mysterious red room hidden in the basement. Missy, the youngest daughter, is said to have begun playing with an imaginary friend called Jody that started to haunt the family as a demonic presence. George repeatedly woke up at around 3:15, the time of the DeFeo murders. The final night proved the most terrifying. The house was supposedly gripped by violent poltergeist activity and mysterious sounds. George felt a heavy, invisible weight pinning him down in his bed.
I'm laying in bed. I'm unable to get up. I can hear my children's beds overhead of me slamming up and down on the floor. And I can't get up to help them.
On the 28th day, they abandoned their new home in terror, leaving all of their possessions behind. Journalist Laura DiDio was the first reporter to talk to the Lutzes about their experiences.
I think something did happen to them, and I think it was cataclysmic, especially that last night where they literally fled the house with just the clothes on their back. All the food was in the refrigerator, all their clothes were in the closet. You know, it just looked as though your house or mine when you leave for work in the morning.
Whatever happened to the Lutz family, it was enough to make them believe that the same supernatural forces that drove them out may also have driven Ronald DeFeo to murder.
We realized there was something so wrong there that it would be inhuman, it would be improper to just let him rot in jail.
Within days of fleeing the Amityville house, they arranged to meet DeFeo's defense attorney, William Weber.
They verbalized to me that they had had unusual experiences in the house, and they thought that by letting me know about it, that this could possibly be an avenue for a new trial for Ronnie DeFeo. They seemed genuine at that point.
But Weber had another idea, one that could make him money. He hoped to write a book on the back of the DeFeo murders and include the Lutz's story.
Before the Lutzes came into the picture, it would have been whether he was criminally insane or he was a cold-blooded killer. When the Lutzes came into it, they threw this third aspect into it, which, let's face it, has pizzazz that could make this an attractive item for the general public. And that was possession. You know, was there any supernatural phenomenon going on in the house? And I put the cards on the table and said, listen, I have a commercial venture in this, and maybe talking with other people, why don't we join together?
On the 16th of February 1976, the Lutzes held a press conference with William Weber to announce a joint collaboration on the book. Their story immediately became hot property.
I don't think that the Lutzes expected this big reaction from the press conference. I think that they were totally unprepared for and very ill at ease with the press coming after them.
With interest in the Amityville case building, local New York news station Channel 5 decided to launch their own investigation into the Lutz's claims.
The race was on to try and get a hold of the Lutzes. It was going to be a ratings grabber. I mean, all of the elements were there. This house had been the scene of a very brutal, even by New York standards, of 6 murders the year before. Now you have this family that moves out in terror. They've had their life savings sunk into this house. So what's there?
DiDio eventually managed to gain the trust of the Lutzes.
They struck me as very ordinary, down-to-earth, normal people. There was nothing extraordinary about them. I mean, other than the fact that they had been frightened by their experience.
Channel 5 decided to test out the Lutz's claims for themselves. They planned to broadcast a TV special of their own supernatural investigation. Heading it, paranormal experts Ed and Lorraine Warren. Ed, a religious demonologist, died in 2006.
Here's your grapes, honey.
Today, Lorraine lives alone in Connecticut, where she runs a museum dedicated to the occult.
We have been involved in 52 exorcisms throughout the world. We have been involved in many poltergeist cases, movement of objects. We have been involved in many diabolical hauntings, and we have been involved in many human hauntings, where spirits, for one reason or another,
do not leave their homes and can cause havoc and upset in a house.
The Warrens arranged a séance in the Amityville house with the help of a team of mediums and parapsychologists. Anchorman Marvin Scott was sent to report from the scene.
It was a cold night, and it was after I had anchored the evening news broadcast. A crew, 3-member crew and myself, went to the house. And at that point, there were a number of parapsychologists, demonologists, psychics, and they were going to try and bring forward that energy, that force they said that was in that house. I had never attended a seance, and I'm a little excited about it. What was I going to experience?
The vibrations were outrageous. How anybody could have spent 28 days in that house is beyond anybody's comprehension. What I could perceive in there was so dark and so negative, I didn't really want to look at it. It was so bad.
In the early hours of the morning, the séance moved to a bedroom where 2 of the DeFeo children had been murdered, and the Lutzes reported poltergeist activity.
When I went in that room, Marvin Scott, this anchor man, he asked me, "What do you feel in here?" And I said, "I hope this is as close to hell as I ever get." I said, "It's like evil personified."
She said she had never felt such a horror that it was in her body. And she started crying and screaming, "I feel it, it's here, it's here." I felt nothing except the pain that she was feeling. I really did not.
I do remember at about 3 in the morning, Marvin Scott turning to me and saying, "I don't think we have it." Meaning what you would like to see The Exorcist on television. Levitations, things flying across the room, any physical manifestation of some sort of psychic or supernatural presence just wasn't there.
I was prepared for anything, and matter of fact, what reporter would not love to have an exclusive interview with a ghost? The only voices I heard that night was that of my crew when we were going to eat the sandwiches we brought along. Saw no oozing of any substance from the walls, the toilets, no flies. We saw none of that.
Although the television crew didn't capture any strange activity, this photo, taken on the night, apparently reveals a mysterious image.
We were all very surprised when there was this clearly very distinct photo of a little boy standing in the doorway with big round eyes and, sort of spooky looking. There is no explanation for it. People have asked me, do I think the photo was faked? No, I don't think so.
As theories multiplied into what was behind the Amityville haunting, the broadcast of the seance launched the Lutz's story straight into the media spotlight. The Amityville horror was now starting to take on a life of its own. In New York, the alleged haunting of the Amityville house was starting to become a media sensation. As the story gathered momentum, in May 1976, the Lutz family moved to Los Angeles to start a new life. It's here they were introduced to Hollywood author Jay Anson. He persuaded the Lutzes he should write the account of their experiences, and made them an offer too good to refuse. This meant ending their book deal with William Weber. But Weber didn't let this put him off. He still hoped to prove that demonic possession drove Ronnie DeFeo Jr. to murder his family. In a bizarre twist, he decided to conduct his own supernatural investigation into the Amityville house.
We were at that point looking into the supernatural aspect of the case, and I wanted to get some people who had recognition in the media, at least, to participate in it.
Weber brought in this man, paranormal expert Hans Holzer. Now 88 years old, he's made the supernatural his life's work.
What you need is a really good, experienced deep trance medium and nothing else.
Holzer enlisted the help of deep trance medium Ethel Johnson Myers to try and find out what was haunting the house. But instead of finding a demonic presence, the team discovered what they claimed was the angry spirit of a Native American buried underneath the property.
As soon as she got into the house, without knowing anything about its history, she said, "There's an Indian here. An Indian. He's buried here."
Why are they angry?
Because it's been a sacred place, and this is over the very, very special chief. Oh, I can't move my face.
When she goes into deep trance, her own personality vanishes, and she takes on another personality.
And what does he make them do?
Violence of death. I don't know, my skull's cracked and my neck's stretched.
What will the male do under those circumstances?
Anything the Indian desires him to do.
With yet another investigation of the house, the explanations into what was behind the alleged haunting were starting to become more bizarre. And then, in September 1977, Jay Anson's book, The Amityville Horror, was published for the first time. Marketed as a true story, it was an instant bestseller. 2 years later, the movie followed. Within 40 days of its release, it took over $46 million at the box office.
Often I'm asked if I was scared that night I spent in the house in Amityville. No, to be quite honest, it was much more fearful the night I spent watching the film with a pot-smoking, rowdy, disruptive audience.
The success of the Amityville Horror turned the Lutzes into media stars.
George and Kathleen Lutz are with us this morning to talk about what happened during those 28 days in Amityville.
But with their fame, they began to face intense scrutiny from both the public and the press. Had they made the whole experience up? Among the doubters were the first family to move into the house a year after the Lutzes moved out. The Cromartys fought to put an end to any speculation that the building was haunted.
This house is not haunted. It never was haunted. It was a money-making fraud.
With the release of the film, lawyer William Weber also spoke out. He said many of the key stories were invented by him the first time he met with the Lutzes. Their claims were starting to unravel.
He says, well, we saw green slime coming out of the doors. I says, you didn't see green slime coming out of the doors. You probably saw residue of the fingerprint powders that were left all over the house. And since you were the first people to reside in the house since the police investigation, that's probably what you saw.
You scared her. She went out the window.
The movie portrays Missy's imaginary friend Jody as a demonic pig that appears at the bedroom window.
I think I was the one who told him about having things appear in the window from outside. They said, what do you mean? I said, well, I knew from the neighbors that they had a cat that was able to jump up to the window on the second floor. And many times people used to walk into the room and see the cat from the outside and get scared for the moment.
In one of the most famous scenes from the film, the priest encounters swarms of flies as he blesses the house.
They said that there were constant flies up in the room that used to be Dawn's. And I said, well, coincidentally, the police indicated when they found the body that the flies were swarming around also.
The Lutzes also claimed they discovered a sinister red room hidden in the basement. The movie portrays this as the source of the supernatural entity haunting the Amityville house. A childhood friend of the DeFeos, Patrick O'Reilly, has a very different take on the story.
I do remember why that room was red, Mr. DeFeo. And myself and Mark were down there, and he grabbed a gallon of paint and brought it out and brought 3 brushes and rollers and said, here you go, boys. This is going to be your toy closet area. Help me paint it. And we did. And why was it red? Because that's the paint he had on hand. If he had blue paint, it would have been the blue room. Very unsinister. It was a toy closet. That was all it was.
So was the haunting of the Amityville house nothing more than an elaborate money-making hoax made on the back of a horrific crime. When the Lutzes first met with William Weber, they recorded their conversation.
George Lutz took out the bottle of wine, which we finished right away, took out the second, the third. I'm pretty sure we finished 4 bottles of wine over a long period of time. There was a lot of giddiness, a lot of laughing, a lot of jokes. And this is despite their alleged experiences at the house.
No one knows what happened to the original tapes, but Laura DiDio is one of the few people to have ever heard them.
Before I even listened to the tape, both Kathy and George Lutz said to me, we're not very proud of this. They were talking about, I guess, how you could expand on the events, make it more lurid, more, fit for, more like The Exorcist, if you will.
There's no question in my mind that they pulled off a successful commercial hoax that generated a lot of money for a lot of people.
But the Lutzes denied this. They maintained the core of their story was the truth. While they admitted the book and the film exaggerated many of their claims, they also believed they were victims of a media frenzy that blurred the line between their fact and fiction. In response to reports that they were lying, Kathy and George undertook a lie detector test. Overseeing it, Chris Gugas, a one-time CIA official, considered a world expert in polygraph readings.
Both of us were subjects of a polygraph test, and we both passed with flying colors.
In their minds, there was no doubt the events at the Amityville house were real. Families reporting hauntings are not unusual. In 2005, a Gallup survey revealed 3 out of 4 Americans believe in the paranormal. If the haunting of the Amityville house wasn't a simple hoax, could there be another explanation for the Lutzes' claims? Skeptic Joe Nichol has been investigating the supernatural for the last 4 decades.
I think there's no doubt that a place that has a powerful tragedy like the Lutz house is going to influence how people respond to it.
Dude, a guy kills his whole family? Doesn't that bother you?
Well, yeah, sure, but houses don't have memories.
Even people who say they've put it out of their mind, as George Lutz is recorded as having said, oh, it didn't bother him and so forth. Well, maybe, but it also might be that at the subconscious level, it is affecting you.
God bless this house and all the people that dwell within it. Blessed be the Lord.
When they moved in, as a practicing Catholic, Kathy Lutz was worried enough by the history of the DeFeo murders to have the house blessed by the family priest, Father Pecoraro. It was in one of the bedrooms where the DeFeo children were murdered that he was said to have heard a voice telling him to get out.
He heard the words "get out" very strongly. He became ill. He had flu-like symptoms. His hands bled openly for a while.
While his diocese denied this ever happened, Laura DiDio disagrees.
That was not an exaggeration. I spoke to Father Pecoraro, who has also since died at the time, and he confirmed that story.
It's in the Catholic tradition that you see exorcisms, that you see an emphasis on demonic possession. Some polls show that Catholics may be among the groups that are higher in believing in ghosts, for example, because they have a rich tradition of apparitional experiences.
Several other key factors may also have made the Lutzes susceptible to believing in the paranormal. In England, Professor Richard Wiseman specializes in the psychology of hauntings.
Some people are fantasy prone. They really do find it difficult to tell the difference between something they've imagined happening and that thing actually happening. So it can be an absolutely terrifying experience. But there's no reason to think these things are actually happening in the real world.
It becomes a snowball effect. For example, no longer is a noise simply some creaking of an old house. It's the footsteps of the ghost.
If you have an experience, and it's quite a scary one, you become hypervigilant. So once you kick this thing off, it can become very contagious, not only for yourself, but those with you.
And that includes the Lutz's children, Danny, Christopher, and Missy. While they've never given an in-depth interview about the 28 days they spent in the house, they do believe there is some truth to their parents' claims. Aged just 5 at the time, Missy started playing with an imaginary friend called Jody. This isn't unusual for a young child. 2/3 of children under the age of 7 at some time develop imaginary friends. But in the Amityville house, it was interpreted as a sign of the demonic.
One can only imagine the terror for children in a situation in which they're led to believe that there are sinister sort of boogeymen at work in a house. Children have fears of demons under their beds, and they have bad dreams and so forth. And of course, the adults are supposed to go comfort them. What happens if the adults need comforting? You have maybe the worst of all possible situations.
Some of George Lutz's most terrifying experiences happened in the early hours of the morning, when he also described being pinned to the bed. But they could have been a result of a disturbed sleep pattern called a waking dream.
Whenever we dream, essentially the brain paralyzes the body so we don't act out the dream and injure ourselves. Now what's interesting is sometimes that system can kind of get out of sync, and so the brain can paralyze the body, but we wake up from the dream. We're conscious but completely paralyzed, and that can be a terrifying experience for people. There's all sorts of extreme imagery that can go through their mind. So if they're drifting into sleep, it's called hypnagogic imagery. As they're coming out, it's hypnopompic. Either way, you can see, animals, demonic entities, figures in the room. And one way of interpreting that is there's some kind of spirit form, maybe sitting on top of them and holding them down. And of course, if you don't realize that essentially the brain is tricking your perception, you can think those things are actually there and that your house is haunted.
Nobody will ever know for sure what happens to the Lutz family inside the Amityville house. But their story captured the imagination of an entire country and the world. With the global success of the film, the sleepy village of Amityville found itself about to pay a heavy price. As the 1979 movie, The Amityville Horror, swept through cinemas across the world, in Amityville itself, the village became inundated with tourists. On some days, the population nearly doubled to 20,000 people.
There was one point that I went by that house, and I literally saw 50 buses. People coming to see the Amityville house.
Amityville is very upscale. It's very insular. A lot of those people have lived there for, generations. So more than anything else, I think that they just wanted it to go away and not be haunted by it.
Former village mayor Emil Pavlik witnessed the impact firsthand.
The crowds were overwhelming for a small village, and the people that live here, they could hardly get in and out of their own houses. Some of them got out a little hatchet and wanted to take a piece of the house with them, and that was stopped, of course. Then there was people that wanted to become overnighters because for some reason they thought that the spirits would emanate at night into the day, and they would see them rise in the morning and rise out of the house. People would be sleeping, and they would wake up in the morning, and there's a group of people camped on their lawn.
The Amityville Horror was the first of another 8 movies and 2 books, all inspired by the events at 112 Ocean Avenue. But while tens of millions were made off the back of their story, the Lutzes claimed they made very little themselves, just $300,000.
Once that movie came out, even more than the book, they lost control. I mean, they just basically faded back into the fabric of Anywhere USA.
The copyright of their story became the subject of several bitter court cases. Eventually, the couple divorced. In 2004, Kathy died, followed 2 years later by George. To the end of their lives, they maintained they were telling the truth, despite heavy criticism that their story was driven by financial greed.
Just as you never can predict how a jury is going to vote, there was no way that the Lutzes could have predicted that it would become this international phenomenon that it did.
The psychological evidence suggests that rather than being victims of demonic entities, the Lutzes were victims of their own fears and anxieties. With the media frenzy surrounding their story, they were destined to live in the shadow of the Amityville Horror for the rest of their lives.
think that the Lutzes, particularly George, after telling the story and repeating it over and over and over again, really came to believe something happened in that house.
Whatever really happened, the Amityville Horror is a story that played out in full view of suburbia and struck at the heart of the American dream.
I guess it was the perfect confluence of events.
Sure, it was unique. I don't think that's going to happen again. I doubt you're ever going to see a recipe like that.
It's a great story if you can tell it right.
Brand new on H2, there's $100,000 on the line for the best marksman, and 18 contestants line up for the right to fight for it. Top Shot starts tomorrow night at 9. Maybe they could do with some of the help the experts are claiming was available from the ancient aliens. That's up next.